Well, hi everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Just wait. The system's been a bit weird today. Well, it's a real pleasure to introduce James Doty. It's a pity we can't meet in person, but our hybrid events have some kind of gremlin associated with them. It's really interesting. But anyway, James is a neurosurgeon, a neuroscientist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist who's had a faculty position at Stanford since 1997. And he's the founder and director of the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, CCARE, of which His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the founding benefactor. Dr. Doty is also the senior editor of the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science. And through CCARE, he's developed programs, techniques, and interventions that are taught throughout the world to promote connection, mental health, and to decrease stress and anxiety through the compassion, cultivation, training, and applied compassion training programs, which are taught throughout the world. His research is cited extensively in lay press, textbooks, and peer-reviewed publications. He's also the New York Times and international best-selling author of Into the Magic Shop, a neurosurgeon's quest to discover the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart, and the soon-to-be-released book, Mind Magic, the neuroscience of manifestation and how it changes everything. He is the former chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation, vice chairman of the Charter for Compassion, and has been senior advisor to the Council of the Parliament of the World's Religions, and serves on the board of directors of Global Compassion Commission. He's also the former CEO of Accuray Company, and has been an advisor, board member, and consultant to several medically related startups. He's also the founder of the mobile app Happy AI, it's HAPPI.ai, a virtual mental health coach based on much of his research. His work on compassion and happiness has recently attracted the attention of the King of Bhutan, and he's also the host of Into the Magic Shop podcast. So as you can see, Dr. Doty is extremely eminent, and we're delighted that he's with us. And as I say, this is our normal format on Zoom. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to him. And I think people are going to be drifting in. Actually, that's 12 participants, 35 of us online. So this happens all the time with us. Anyway, people will drift in, and we look forward to your talk very much. So with that, if I may, I'll just hand over to you and take it away.
Listen, thank you all so much for having me. It's really a blessing, and I'm very appreciative. Today, I think we're going to talk about how compassion changes lives, but it's going to be in part centered on the science of compassion, but it's also going to have a discussion of how we got here. In some aspects, how religions actually developed around the fundamental core of compassion being a central tenet. So let me first, though, tell you a little bit about myself, although thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I grew up in a very challenging environment. My father was an alcoholic, and my mother was had had a stroke when I was a child, and we were on public assistance throughout my childhood. And in fact, we were evicted from multiple residences. And of course, I think anyone listening can appreciate how these types of challenges when you're a child influence you profoundly. And I think probably everyone listening appreciates that the events that occurred in their childhood often result in baggage, for good or bad, that affects their entire lives, and also affects many of their decisions and relationships. And in fact, oftentimes many people can't understand why they keep repeating the same type of events that are detrimental to their own well-being as well as those around them. And until you can sit down and examine the baggage that you're carrying in your lives, it's very hard to change. One of the things that allowed me to move beyond my own, if you want to call them, limited beliefs, or my own hypercriticality or lack of self-compassion, was events that occurred in a magic shop when I was 12. And I know that seems awfully young, but what would happen when I was a child that age was that there were frequent arguments in my home, and it was quite chaotic. And on some level, it was as if there was a constant war going on in the sense of unpredictability, chaos, and disruption, which for a child is very hard to cope with. And oftentimes you blame yourself as somehow being responsible. So what happened to me, though, was that I was blessed because during one of those arguments, I got on my bicycle and drove as far and as fast away from my house, and I ended up at a strip mall. And in the strip mall was a magic shop. Now, the importance of that is that when I walked in, there was an individual, and you have to remember this was before we talked about neuroplasticity or even meditation or mindfulness practices. And at the counter was this woman in her mid-50s who greeted me with this radiant smile and this presence about her. And it turned out she knew nothing about magic. She was the owner's mother. But what she did know about was people. And she gave me a sense that it was okay, that I was okay. And she treated me with dignity and respect and was interested in what I had to say. And the reason that's important is for many of us, especially in the modern world, we are terrified of people judging us or making assumptions about us. But she made me feel very comfortable. And as a result, we had a significant conversation over 20 to 30 minutes. And at the end of it, she said to me, she said, "I'm here for another 6 weeks. I think I could teach you something that could really help you." And she in fact did. And that conversation and interaction with her fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life. Because prior to that, one, I was very critical of myself. Two, I had a negative worldview, meaning that I felt that the world was against me, that my likelihood for getting out of my situation was essentially zero. And as a result, I was filled with hopelessness and despair. So what this woman taught me actually was a Buddhist based mindfulness practice that included
We're just going to hear it.
I'm hearing somebody talk. So, but
Please mute your microphones.
Please mute your microphones. This is the air traffic controller. Oh, anyway, so she taught me first a practice to relax the body, because I didn't realize my muscles were tense. And if your muscles are tense, which is because I was always expecting the unexpected and could not relax, she taught me how to relax my body. And then she taught me to attend or be focused through a practice of looking actually at a candle. And then the third part, once I had understood that, was to reflect on the negative dialogue that was going on in my head, which of course all of us have. And as a result of that, it allowed me to change my negative self-talk to one primarily of positive self-affirmation. The key about that, though, was that when we beat ourselves up and we constantly have negative self-talk, this results us in having a distorted view of the world, because oftentimes we are just as hypercritical of others. And once she taught me these practices, amazing things happened. One, I could relax. Two, I could focus. And I think all of us appreciate that. The ability to attend and focus allows you to be present, which is the fundamental aspect of our humanity, which is critical for our own happiness, but also critical for our physiology to work at its best. And also, when you look through the lens of negativity and the nature of our evolution, which I will talk about in a bit, relates to this, is that you look at everything outside of yourself with a negative attitude. As an example, I used to have a lot of anger and hostility towards my parents, not so much that they didn't love me, but that they were unavailable to me. And the reason was because they, I realized, could not or did not have the tools to help them with their own suffering. And as a result, my father tried to dull his own pain with alcohol. And my mother became more and more depressed and attempted suicide multiple times. Ultimately, when I changed the narrative that I had been telling myself, it allowed me to change how I looked at the world, but more importantly, how the world looked at me. And from that, she taught me a visualization or a manifestation technique, which ultimately allowed me to succeed by Western standards. And I say that in some ways pejoratively, because unfortunately in the West, we have a narrative that success, meaning wealth, position, and power, equates with happiness. And unfortunately, this has been promoted throughout Western culture. And what it has created is a group of extraordinarily unhappy people who are often self-focused and who acquire things in the belief that these things will make them happy. And obviously, it does not do so. Now, unfortunately, many of us have to go down that path before we realize the difference between what we would call hedonic happiness, meaning seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and fundamentally acquiring things under the false notion that having things will make you more attractive and make you happy. Now, on some level, what it does is it takes a lot of people who have been delivered that narrative that they look at people oftentimes and say, wow, I wish I was like them because their life seems so perfect. And unfortunately, the people who have achieved these things demonstrate this and play up to this because, unfortunately, every human has an emptiness inside themselves that they chronically try to fill, and filling it with things or attachment to things is not a cause of happiness. Because what happens is that external affirmation is hollow. In my own case, I had achieved everything I had put on this list when I was younger. I went to medical school. I had a mansion. I was a multimillionaire. I was driving sports cars. I was dating attractive women. I had a Rolex on my wrist. And here I am. All of my friends are telling me how great my life is and how they wish they were like me. And I was never more miserable in my entire life. Now, the thing that ultimately got my attention, and ultimately this will lead us to a discussion of evolution and science and the why of why we should choose eudaimonic happiness, which is the other side of that coin, is what happened to me later in life. I ended up going to medical school, becoming a neurosurgeon, which of course in medicine is at the pinnacle of all specialty medicine. Somebody has their cell phone on probably. But so theoretically, that's the pinnacle of medicine. I was a successful entrepreneur, ran a $1.3 billion company. And I had all the toys and different things. And then during the dot-com crash, in 6 weeks, I lost $80 million. And I will assure you that that does get your attention. I was $3 million in the hole. And when that happens, you have two friends who become an important part of your life. One of those, in my case, was my banker, because I had borrowed $15 million from the bank based on the stock that I had, which was now worthless. And the other was my lawyer, who had to help me get out of some of these things. And during this period of time, here I was believing I was a success. And I went through a period of self-reflection where I realized I had actually not really listened to what this woman named Ruth had taught me. And what I mean by that is that I looked at this through the lens of a 12-year-old without any self-awareness, or frankly, because of my own suffering, because of my own poverty. I looked at the world through the lens of things that I wanted, believing that if I got them, that would make me happy. And so after this period of deep reflection, and I went over all that Ruth had taught me, I realized that I had made a huge mistake, because unfortunately, I was attached to things, believing that that would fulfill the emptiness. So during this period of reflection, it turned out that my lawyer informed me that the um, uh, um, philanthropy that I had anticipated doing, they had actually not fulfilled or completed the paperwork and turned it in. So the stock that I had actually allocated for charity, and again, it wasn't necessarily because I wanted to be charitable, it was so people would look at me and say I was a nice guy, and it was for tax purposes, which unfortunately, that is the source of many people's giving. Long story short, I could have kept all of this stock in this company that had yet to go public. And after this period of deep reflection, I chose to go ahead and still give all of that stock away to charity. And what I tell people is that I went from rags to riches to rags. But when I made the decision to go ahead and give all of that stock to charity, which ended up being $30 million, and I set up health clinics and blood banks around the world. I set up programs for the disabled and the handicapped. I set up programs for adolescents affected by AIDS, HIV. I endowed academic chairs at multiple universities. I funded research. What I tell people is that is when actually I became rich. And I became rich not so much in money, but I became rich because I had a vision of what the true nature of reality is. And the true nature of reality is connection to that part of ourselves which connects us to all humanity, which is a realization of ultimately our oneness, seeing the other as yourself. Now, certainly, I don't want anyone to feel pity for me, because even having lost several $1 million and being in debt $3 million, I was still a neurosurgeon and still made more money than 99% of the population. So I was not living on the street by any way, shape, or form. Although, interestingly enough, the Oprah Winfrey Show called me up and wanted to hear my sob story of how my life had been ruined. And this was as a result of a Wall Street Journal article done at the time. And my statement was, I have nothing to complain about. I'm the most blessed person in the world. I have done all of these incredible things. I've learned so many positive lessons that have changed my life. And I am still very well to do. My life actually did not change significantly whatsoever, but my perception of the world and my responsibility to the world changed. So once I did that, the next thing that interestingly happened was that I changed my perspective of being a doctor. And I don't mean to say in any way that I was a bad doctor or didn't care, but my focus was mostly on me, similar to this hedonic happiness, being attached to things, being attached to a title, to power, position. And I changed that narrative to understanding that the greatest thing I can give is not to have attachment to things, but to be of service to others. And that's where I became very rich, if you will. And this heads over to now a discussion of eudaimonic happiness. We talked about hedonic happiness, and this is very much related to a selfish view of the world and, unfortunately, attachment to things, versus eudaimonic happiness, which is associated to purpose and meaning. And the difference between the two is that hedonic happiness is transitory and shallow, while eudaimonic happiness is associated with depth, and it's a much longer feeling. But the other interesting thing about it is, in some ways, this is the difference between living through a lens of fear and anxiety versus living through a lens of love and caring. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes people who are so focused on things are terrified of being judged or terrified of the notion of scarcity. So they grasp onto things. And I think for many of us, especially those who study Buddhism, we know that attachment and craving is the greatest source of suffering. And there's nothing wrong with accomplishing things and living well. The difference is that being able to have a realistic perception is hugely important. If you are attached to these things, you're going to be unhappy. For myself, I don't want to give the impression that somehow I don't enjoy living in a beautiful home. I drive a Porsche. I don't enjoy going to nice restaurants. I do. The difference is, though, if they're all gone tomorrow, it has no impact on my perception of myself or my sense of happiness. Zero. And it's interesting because some people, when I tell this narrative, they go, well, I understand that, but I would just like to have all those things anyway and find out for myself that it's unimportant, which is so I certainly can appreciate that. But my point is that when you understand the difference, you understand the power of how being caring and compassionate affects others, but more importantly, yourself. And as His Holiness said, this is His Holiness of the Dalai Lama, not necessarily the multitude of other holinesses that I know. I see we have time left, 10 minutes. I don't know what's going on there, but I'll continue on until the screen goes blank. But go ahead.
So, James, we want to continue. So if it does turn off in 9 minutes or so, please rejoin again. I'm so sorry about this.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm used to this. It's no big deal. It's just part of life, you know. Anyway, as you know, His Holiness, of which we all know, the Dalai Lama, says, if you want to make others happy, be compassionate. If you wish to be happy, be compassionate. And it's interesting because if you look of the experiences that span literally thousands of years in the context of Buddhism, but essentially every major religion, and at the core, fundamentally, is compassion and the golden rule. And of course, these truths about the importance of these things depending on your culture, has been wrapped around a narrative or a dogma which works for that culture or society. And many people would then argue that that's the source of the major religions, if not all of them. But it's interesting because this is actually based on physiology. I mentioned to you a choice of fear versus love. So when you look through the lens of scarcity, that is a fear narrative that activates a portion of your autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system arises in your brainstem and is distributed throughout your body through various organs, most predominantly in your heart. And this is a two-way street, not a one-way street. And in fact, the communication between the heart to the brain is more than the brain to the heart. And so we have two divisions. One division is the sympathetic nervous system. And many people call this the flight, fight, or freeze response. And the other is the parasympathetic nervous system, or what is commonly called the rest and digest system. So what's the difference between the two? Well, we have to look at evolution and how we evolved as a species. So firstly, what I would suggest, I like in my upper screen, it looks like somebody's playing golf, which I find sort of fascinating. Hello, Mr. Golfer there. Where was I going with this? Oh, anyway, what I was talking about was that the sympathetic nervous system, which is commonly called the flight, fight, or freeze response, gets activated, of course, when we're fearful or anxious or afraid. And when we survived on the savannah in Africa 200,000 years ago or so, this made perfect sense. It was created to respond to immediate threat. And as a result, different hormones and different parts of your brain were activated, as well as various neurotransmitters, which worked in concert to allow you to escape from the threat. And when that happened, or if you survived, your system would immediately go back down, and then you would engage your parasympathetic nervous system, and which I mentioned is the rest and digest system. Well, how are these different? When you engage the sympathetic nervous system, or the flight, fight, or freeze response, it does several things. One is it effectively shuts down one of your cognitive brain networks called the executive control network, which is located in your frontal area and allows you access to memories or experiences to make discerning decisions. Because when your life is at threat, you don't need that. You're making the quickest, fastest, shortest decision possible to survive. But other things happen. One is it affects your peripheral physiology, in that your heart rate goes up and your blood pressure because of the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Your heart rate variability actually goes down. A decrease in heart rate variability is associated with sudden cardiac death. You have the release of inflammatory proteins, or an increase in manufacture. The immune system is negatively affected. The release of stress hormones like cortisol dramatically go up. And again, this is meant for the short term to allow you to escape from a threat. Unfortunately, in modern society, for so many people, our lives are so much different that these systems, for many people, are chronically activated, oftentimes at a low to moderate level. And the effect of that creates a great degree of unhappiness, which I will talk about. It also results in the occurrence of a variety of chronic disease states, as well as acute effects, and it decreases one's longevity. And what all of this means is that we are actually designed or made, if you will, to have the parasympathetic nervous system as the predominant factor or engagement or activation in our lives. And what happens when we activate the parasympathetic nervous system? Well, one is we gain access or cause our executive control network to function at its best, which gives us access to memory and experiences, access to insights. We are more productive. We are more creative. We are more thoughtful. We are more open. We are less judgmental. We look through the lens of generosity. And it has amazing peripheral physiologic effects in that your heart rate variability is increased, which may seem paradoxical, but that is a good thing. Your heart rate is lowered, your blood pressure is lowered, your immune system is boosted, the expression of inflammatory proteins is decreased, the levels of stress hormones like cortisol are diminished. And actually, ultimately, even if you look at the telomeres or those parts of the genes that are associated with our longevity, they're actually lengthened or they shorten at a much lower rate. Meaning that when you're thoughtful, when you're open, when you're generous, when you're kind, when you're compassionate, that's how we're meant to be. And actually, when we are that way, we live longer. Now, let's put it into a little further context to understand this more clearly. I'm sure many of you have heard of something called the blue zones. The blue zones are places in the world where people routinely live greater than 100 years. And why is that? Now, I'm sure all of you have seen the 1 million or more Mediterranean diet cookbooks, which are everywhere. Combined with the narrative of exercise, moderate exercise, not smoking, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is true, but it turns out that the most important aspect of what we've learned from studying the blue zones is actually the most important factor for longevity, health, wellness, is human connection and depth of relationships. And that is the gift that compassion gives you, and that is the gift that it gives you in terms of your own happiness and longevity. Well, why is that? If you look at how we evolved as a species centuries ago, where did we live? We lived in groups of people, typically under 150, a community. Everyone knew each other. And they knew you from the time you were born till the time you died. We lived in multi-generational families, meaning we lived with our siblings, our children, our parents, our grandparents. And we were not all that I'm trying to say. So it's no problem at all. So as I was saying, before this beautiful, brief, transient interruption of our conversation, was that we grew up in these places where we were not judged, where people accepted us as we were, who offered us advice, suggestions, and help in learning how to be a good human being. And this is in contrast to living in the modern world. Unfortunately, in the modern world, many people do not live with their parents or other relatives. They're separated from their siblings. They are not living in a community. In fact, many people are transitory, meaning they may have a job in one place for a period of time, then they move to another job after a while. And the problem with this is that now we carry the burden of fear and anxiety about being judged by not being good enough. And this, unfortunately, is where the narrative of hypercriticality comes from. You know, if you look in some of the less developed countries, And in fact, if you look in a number of Buddhist countries, this issue of feeling you're not good enough or you're unworthy actually does not really exist, because they live in communities where they are loved, they are accepted, and not ones where people are afraid that people are going to judge them and not accept them. And the problem is, when you live with that narrative in your head, it promotes hypercriticality. It results in this constant negativity, and it limits your ability, frankly, because in some ways this is living in fear about judgment, that you do not get the health benefits that we were talking about because you're constantly stressed and anxious. And it changes how you interact with people in the world. The other interesting study that further validates this reality, and some of you may have heard of it, is the Harvard study, which is called the Adult Development Study, but it's been going on for 85 years, and it's more commonly referred to as the Harvard Longevity and Happiness Study. And again, just to reiterate, that study further validates that people who have depth of relationships, human connection, live longer and are much happier people. And their focus is not on things, it's on being of service to others, caring for others, connecting with others. Now, I mentioned evolution, and we talked about it a little bit. If you look at our species, we have smaller litters, if you will, smaller groups of offspring, typically 1 to 2 children, and not a large number of children. And unlike other species, our offspring do not run off into the forest or the jungle or swim away. We have to care for them. And caring, which takes well beyond a decade, results in an immense amount of time and resource commitment. Well, as a result, we have a genetic imperative that motivates us to spend the time and resources caring for our offspring. And what that is the release of different types of neurotransmitters or hormones, one of which many of you know, which is called oxytocin, or the love or bonding or affiliative hormone. And what happens when that is released is that your pleasure and reward centers are stimulated. So you are actually rewarded for caring. And of course, if you looked how we evolved from the nuclear family to typically in groups of less than 150, it was critical to be able to identify individuals who were suffering or needed to be helped, because if not, it would put the entire tribe at risk. Now, another interesting fact, and there are a couple here, is that once you get beyond 150 people in number, it's hard to keep track of individuals in terms of what they're doing. And some people may be lazy, or some people may try to cheat once the number gets beyond that. So that turned out to be like an important number. And in fact, I think if I recall correctly, that's called Dumbarton's number. And some people would argue that that actually is the source of the creation of religion. Now, what do I mean by that? One is, interestingly, that we're one of the few species, if only species, that has an understanding of our finite existence. And that realization for many people results in stress and anxiety. The other is that to keep people doing the right thing, who have a vision or a understanding of our finite existence, results in the creation of a narrative that there is an omniscient being, an all-seeing being, who knows what you're doing, and if you are good or follow the rules, then you're rewarded by having either everlasting life in the right place or a not so good life in the wrong place, or you get reincarnated. And so this serves as a dogma that then allows us to create society or larger groups of people living together. Obviously, it's an imperfect system, as we're seeing in the present day, but that is, if you follow the science, that's sort of how it all interrelates. So the other aspect which I want to talk about is how we create a narrative that limits our belief in possibilities for ourselves. And what I'm talking about is the reality that many of us give our self-agency away. And what I mean by that is, how many of you have been in a position where you have expressed a goal, a dream, a desire, and you've had friends, relatives who tell you, you'll never do that, it's not possible. And unfortunately, a lot of people listen to that, especially children. And this, unfortunately, is the power of words for many, because once you make the statement, it is not possible, I am not worthy, I do not deserve, that becomes truth.
Mhm.
Conversely, if you look at the world with a belief that anything is possible, that has a huge, huge effect on your physiology. And actually, it allows you to accomplish many things that you would think are impossible. As an example, many of you are familiar with the Buddhist monks who have the ability to change their body temperature or their heart rate, even though these are at an unconscious level being regulated. But with different types of meditative practices, you can gain access to change your physiology. And if you look at other people, ultra marathon runners, another is Wim Hof, who climbed Mount Everest in shorts. Our ability to do extraordinary things is within us. We just have to learn how to master our unconscious. And the power truly is within us. But one of the things that limits us is if we are trying to accomplish things through a selfish narrative. And what I mean by that, if your focus is on, as an example, saying, well, I want to have $1 million, I want to live in a big house because you want to show people how important you are, then that actually limits your ability to accomplish that. If the actions you choose to engage in actually are for the service of others or the benefit of others, that is when your physiology actually works its best. And these various cognitive brain networks, such as the executive control network, the salience network, the attention network, the default mode network, all interact to actually allow you to manifest what often people believe might be impossible otherwise. But also, when you look through the lens of caring for others, oftentimes it changes what you believe you want to one of understanding what you need. And what you need is fundamentally the human connection that makes not only your physiology work its best, but it makes your psyche function at its best because of the power of human connection to make us feel good about ourselves, our place in this world, and gives our life meaning and purpose. The other things I just want to reflect on is the reality that many of us are attached to goals or trying to achieve something. And certainly as a species, we in some ways are designed to do that. But there can be two problems with that. One is if you sacrifice everything to achieve a goal, yet you have left carnage in your wake in doing so. So you've climbed the top of the mountain and you're alone. And we have heard this narrative over and over again, where people have sacrificed so much for one thing, and then that one thing turns out to have zero value. Because the most important aspect of trying to achieve goals is actually the journey you're on with other people. The other aspect, and we talked about the nature of suffering, is associated with attachment and craving. And the problem is that if you don't achieve that goal, for many people, this causes a great amount of suffering. And so this has to go with the concept of non-attachment. It's not so much that the goal is not worthy, but all of us cannot achieve every goal we want to. And to be so attached that the very nature of that attachment causes you unhappiness is very unhealthy. And people who believe that somehow they want to live in that place where they get all of this accolades or all of these accolades or external affirmation, while it's wonderful and it feels great, as we were talking about earlier, that is very, very transitory. But the other thing that people don't appreciate is that there are times where things don't work out, where we suffer because some of these goals or aspirations don't happen. Now, the problem with that is, first of all, as a human being, you're never going to avoid those situations. That is the nature of a human being. But again, it also has to do with non-attachment, because you have an understanding that these negative experiences are also transitory. But if you compare the two, where is it that you learn the greatest lessons about yourself? It's not when you're at the top of the mountain getting all of these accolades. It's when you're suffering. You're trying to understand what happened. What is the lesson I should learn here? How do I survive here? You learn about the internal strength that you have within yourself. You learn about resilience. You learn about possibilities you might not have thought were possible before. You see the world through a lens of being much more kind and thoughtful due to the nature of your own suffering. But the important thread that actually helps you exist in this situation is what we call equanimity, or evenness of temperament. You are not attached to either end. You understand them, you appreciate them, you try to avoid them if you can, but you cannot. But you look at them through the same lens. It's wonderful if things work out great, but you're not attached to that. It's not so great when you have to go through these other experiences, but they're almost invariably transitory. And this, again, is the difference between eudaimonic and happiness and hedonic happiness as well. So we have this incredible ability to change our brains through different types of meditative practices. We have the ability to choose the lens that we look through at the world. And fundamentally, it is our choice in regard to being happy. There is no external entity that is going to suddenly make you feel okay about yourself. It is a gift that you give yourself. You just have to understand that you hold the key to that room. And that room can either be a prison that is dark and small, or it can be a key to a universe of unlimited possibility and beauty. So that is the summation of what I was going to talk about. I'm happy to answer any questions. So there you have it.
Beautiful. So inspiring, James. Well, if anyone would like to ask a question, please unmute. We have a few people, and Richard, maybe we can start with you if you have a few questions, or Ron.
Let me start. Can you hear me okay, everyone? So, it's a really fascinating kind of combination, your approach of full-on materialism and Buddhism. It's really something. I'm fascinated by, I want to ask you a straight question. So if I was to make a drug that could switch people into their parasympathetic nervous system, do you think they would become compassionate and kind? Would that be it? Would that be all you had to do, was just shift their physiology? Or do you think there's more? And if there is more, what is that more? Because in many ways, it's as if you have almost like two views here. And I'd be interested to know what your reaction is to that.
Well, that is a good question. In some ways, to actually appreciate compassion or engagement with the parasympathetic nervous system, you also have to have the sympathetic nervous system. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, you cannot have the lotus without the mud, right? So switching people over to where they're simply engaged with this sense of caring for others, that would be wonderful. But the question is, will it work the same way if there is not some degree of suffering or the need to strive to not suffer and to recognize that others are suffering? As an example, there was a movie, there was a cartoon, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was about some little robot who had a rectangular head. But anyway,
Wally.
Yeah, the narrative was that you have this group of people who get everything. They don't have to work. Life is filled with pleasure. Nobody suffers, and they just sit there and become fat, and not, so having everything actually ends up leaving you with nothing. So that's how I would look at that. I've had the joy and the pleasure to interact not only with His Holiness, but a number of people, including Thich Nhat Hanh, Solgol Rinpoche, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Sadhguru, Radhanath Swami, Chinanand, Eckhart Tolle, Byron Katie, and all of these people are friends of mine, and I've spent a fair amount of time with all of them. Now, I could argue who have the best message, and that's a personal choice, and we won't get into that at this moment. But the point of this discussion is that fundamentally, this idea of spirituality or connecting with a deeper self is a great need in many, many people, and it is not to be dismissed. Now, you could argue that you're simply adding an external, which people attach to, and then that becomes the driver for changing how their brain works. And that's okay if it's for a positive narrative. For myself, to be frank with you, I believe in nothing. I believe that once you die, you're dead, and that's it. And I have no anxiety about that. It doesn't bother me. I don't need to live forever. And I look at it that every day is a blessing. Every second in this world is incredible, and I'm thankful for that. But when it's gone, that's perfectly okay. Now, some people may find that bizarre or strange, especially since I know all these spiritual and religious leaders. But the interesting thing about it is that the reason I connect with them on some level is one, I don't need them. I'm not asking for anything from them other than understanding the nature of connecting with people and the message that they bring, but I'm not there to be their follower or to worship them. And, one of the sad parts is um, this has a huge effect oftentimes on people where they sacrifice so much oftentimes to their own lack of benefit sometimes, but more challenging, and I think we've all seen it in whatever religion it is that the ego structure of individuals gets out of control when people worship them. And that, I think, is a big challenge and something very, very hard to deal with as a human being. And of course, as I mentioned, we have seen innumerable scandals related to the guru acolyte relationship.
So you reject karma completely then?
Yes, in
Really
fact,
interesting. You kind of got all the Buddhist friends and all the Hindu friends, but you reject the fundamental tenet of what they believe. It's like, I wonder if they realize. But it's like, so you don't buy any of it. Basically.
nothing. No, and it's funny because the Dalai Lama and I were having a discussion one time, and this discussion was, if somebody is fundamentally doing good in the world to help others, does the underlying motivation is that important? As an example, let's say somebody may have stolen money and now he's giving it all away, which we see in a lot of, unfortunately, in the way in which our society works. Although they would never say they stole the money. They just created a situation where it came to them. But regardless, so I was talking to His Holiness about this, and I said, so does it really matter? And he said, well, it only matters if you believe in karma. Now, the other aspect which I would suggest to you, and you may disagree with it, is what is the purpose of karma? You could argue that it is a narrative that allows people to get screwed over by a system in the real world or the living world and accept it without complaint. As an example, if you were in India in the lowest caste and you get shit on every day, you're somehow supposed to accept that you deserve to get shit on every day because you did something in a past life. Now, I cannot buy into that. That is not fair. But if you're a Brahmin, it seems perfectly fair. And in fact, it's some ways how our system works in our modern society. We have a group of centimillionaires and billionaires who somehow think that God has decided that they're blessed and special and they should get all these benefits. There should be no regulations for them, and that they should get as much money as possible. And they will create legislation and do all sorts of heinous acts to take away benefits from others to take advantage of them. And it's the narrative is no different. Those in power create the rules. It's just like victors create the rules. So I have, my belief is that these are all made by man. Men are selfish and sometimes ruthless. And this makes up a small percentage of people. But unfortunately, those are the people who seek power. And we see the effects of that, of course. Now, does that seem strange?
Not really. It's just that you haven't really answered the question, which is, okay, so if I make this pill, am I going to get nice people? Or does
I did respond to that because
does it take intentionality as well? And if it does, where does that intentionality come from? Because that's where, I mean, I get the Hindu thing about karma, but actually that's not a Buddhist position. But the intentionality is very interesting, because a lot of what the sort of metaphysical structure of karma is about is trying to understand that and the role that intentionality plays in our experience. And where does it come from? I mean, are you going to say it's an evolutionary thing that's come because we lived in groups and that's how it's come? I mean, I'd just be interested to hear the account to see you understand it.
Well, that's exactly right. I don't think there's any mystery. I mean, we have to survive. as a species. And by the nature of our evolution, we survive by caring for our offspring or those around us or our tribe. And that is the explanation. I don't think you have to somehow look about 1,000 past lives to come up with that narrative. I mean, it's like, I'm sure you've heard of the flying spaghetti monster, right? Or maybe you haven't. Well, if you look at religions, they typically have 9 or 10 components that are consistent throughout all of them. So there was a group of engineers, which probably isn't surprising, who created a religion based on these 9 tenets, and they called it the flying spaghetti monster. And so their god is the flying spaghetti monster. And in fact, there was one who had his driver's license picture done wearing a spaghetti colander on his head. And they had to do it because, of course, they allow Hindus or to wear, or I should say, what are they? Sikhs to wear their turbans. And so why should this be any different? And again, who are we to judge? You have chosen Buddhism, tenets of Buddhism, but there's one narrative that says a god got sick and vomited us out, and that is how our existence. Well, why is that any different than Zeus or any of these other things? They're all magical thinking that allow people to live in their culture and survive with a moral, ethical framework that allows them to exist in this world. And there are a ton of them. I am in no position to judge as an example, the 35,000 different sects of Christianity, or I'm sure the innumerable number of different sects of Buddhism. Who the hell made me the judge? And if you look at the innumerable numbers of these, I can't say in any way that I'm right, although based on science, I can make a very good argument. Based on all the other, it's just gobbledygook that somebody made up. So you ask my belief, that's my belief.
James, I'd like to ask a quick question. I know there's someone on chat that also wants to ask a question, but let me get mine in real quick. Because you mentioned the blue zones and how organized religion served its purpose in terms of almost a social control function, but also was providing community. And what we see now is the breakdown of institutional and decay of organized religions, which has led to this meaning crisis or crisis of meaning in society, especially now with social media, social comparisons on social media, and all the kind of mental health problems that are happening with teenagers and so on and so forth. But I know you've declared yourself as a devout atheist, and I respect that completely, because now it's interesting that you now see chaplains now that are actually atheist chaplains, spiritual directors, which is a very interesting phenomenon because we know that the nuns, the spiritual but not religious demographic is a growing demographic. And it seems like whether you call compassion or not a religion, it seems like you're moving in the direction of addressing this gap in human society by focusing on compassion. Can you speak to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the fundamental core of our existence as a species is compassion. This is caring for others. It makes us feel better. It allows for our survival. And in the context of how we evolved, not only has it allowed our nuclear family to survive, but it allows us to survive, again, evolutionarily in tribes, and especially in a harsh environment. The challenge is, of course, how do you deal with all these people now? And as you point out, I would suggest that one of the greatest threats to our society is human selfishness and ego, which is characterized through the ruthless capitalist narrative, which is what's destroying society. And the problem is that this narrative and the power seekers or the money seekers their goal is to manipulate people through creating fear. And how do you create fear is you define an other and objectify them. And then that results in our tribal instincts by creating a narrative that we are right, they are wrong, they are against us, they're going to destroy us. But in a globally connected world, a sensible person realizes that we all pretty much want the same thing. We want to live in peace. We want our families to be able to eat, have shelter, have security. But this is against the narrative of the nature of acquisition and holding things, which is the hedonic narrative. And at the end of the day, though, the vast, vast, vast majority of people actually want to live their lives. They don't want to be billionaires. They want their families to be safe. They want to interact with others and care for others. That is how most people really want to live in this world. And we get distorted by a false narrative that has been promoted by capitalist, ruthless society. And so I have obviously great respect for any belief system that encourages a positive narrative among that group of people. And whether it's Buddhism or, which, as you can tell, I mean, I probably resonate with much more than many other things because it's not really a religion per se, more of a philosophy. But you know, I think that's the challenge of our time, is how do we bring people together? I believe that promoting the narrative of compassion is one of the strongest things that we can do, because, as you said, people are falling away from religion for a variety of reasons. One is, frankly, we see all the negative aspects of it and all the hate that's promoted by it, and a lot of young people are completely turned off by that. We see the power structures there and the imperfect nature of many of the people involved in terms of sex scandals or money scandals or taking advantage of other people. And so people want something that they feel they can trust, that is honest and perhaps more based on science, and that isn't dishonest. So I think that's you know, one of the reasons that so many people are falling away from it. The other argument you can make, which is sort of interesting, is if you look at the Nordic countries, which is probably the greatest decrease in people interested in religion, is because they have a social safety net. So they have substituted the government on some level for a belief in God, because typically God becomes very important if you're suffering and you don't have enough. And in fact, there's a narrative, of course, that says there are no atheists in the foxholes, right? During a war, because they're terrified and they're scared and they're grasping on anything. I always say there are no foxholes. I mean, there are no atheists in a plane that's going through turbulence. So
That's great. Okay, may I ask, there's Catherine who's been raising her hand, and I'm so sorry, we're gonna have to tune in again to the link that I've provided in 4 minutes. So maybe you could ask the question and then we'll come back for the response. We really enjoyed this conversation, James. This is not by any means a signal for you to go. This is more like we want more of you.
okay, I'll be back. So I have to, is this a different link then?
No, it's the same link, but maybe we could hear the question because we have 4 minutes still.
What is the deep penetrating question?
Right. What is this question? Well, first, I just want to make the comment because I found that it was really interesting talking about religion and kind of the falling apart of religion in this time. And I think I might be one of the only people that's a little bit excited about that, because I think that given the opportunity to think for ourselves in a heartfelt way, we usually do pretty good. It's when we have things that separate us that make the trouble. And so this falling away of religion, for me, I'm kind of excited to see how it turns out. I may not see the end of it in my lifetime, but I'm certainly seeing the beginning of it. And it's pretty exciting for me. I know that sounds very odd and weird, but I know that there's a lot of turbulence around it, but the result, I think, may end up being quite beautiful. So I thought I'd just throw that out there. But my question
Oh, I was
was,
going to say that wasn't a question, but
I
go ahead.
know, but the question, I know, I wanted to make the statement. I just,
Okay.
you know,
So we
sometimes
have
you just want to be heard. I don't know.
statement and question. Yes, yes. Okay.
Yeah. And
We,
so the question is, and it has nothing to do with the religious part, but, you know, because being human is not always easy. And sometimes we get stuck in the weeds and we get stuck in the ruggedness of life. And then these qualities that we try to cultivate of compassion and kindness and altruism kind of fall by the wayside, and the ugly little gremlins come up and they start taking over in our heads. And I'd like to know, Dr. Doty, what is your favorite or your go-to, you know, practice for yourself when you get in the weeds of life? Because I like to ask this question of people because I often get stuck too, and I have my ways, but sometimes they don't work. So I like to collect ways.
that's a good question. We have to go now. Well, I'll start and I'll come back. But first of all, I want to tell you that you know, sometimes people look at other people who give these types of talks and somehow think they have magic answers. I do not. I have answers that might work for myself. And I also want to tell you that I am an imperfect human being who has made multiple mistakes and has failed at multiple things. And I in no way want anyone to somehow think that I have solved the riddle of being human. That being said, you asked me about my personal practice. So I have a meditation practice that is not necessarily a traditional one, but it is one that has evolved over well over 50 years since I was 12. And what it comprises is one, I sit by the side of my bed and I go through a breathing exercise every morning, and I and which of course shifts me with that breathing exercise into engagement of my parasympathetic nervous system. Then the next thing is that I sit and think of the awe of this world. And Dacher Keltner has recently published a book on awe, which I would suggest anyone read. And then I think of the joy of being in this world. And then next, I go through 10 letters of the alphabet, which can be found in my first book. It's fine. So getting back to my answer, so basically it's 10 letters of the alphabet. And my first book, which is called Into the Magic Shop, I talk about that. And it was part of a lecture I gave to incoming medical students. So the 10 letters are C, compassion for self and others; D, recognizing the dignity of every person; E, practicing equanimity; F, practicing forgiveness; G, having gratitude; H, which is particularly hard for a neurosurgeon, humility; I, integrity and values that bound your behavior; J is justice in the context of our responsibility for the vulnerable; K is kindness, which has nothing to do with suffering, of course. And then all of this is contained by love. So that practice, which I do every morning, centers me. And if I get stuck in the day, I will stop and pause and reflect on that alphabet or one of the letters. And the other thing, in the evening, oftentimes, I will sit down and go through what I have gratitude for. And that also is understanding of how blessed I am to be in this world, even with all the innumerable problems, setbacks, and other things. You could call this um, dispositional optimism. And there's actually a body of literature on this, which relates to the fact that while we may want things to happen in a particular time frame, we have no control over that. But if you have this absolute belief in the narrative that goodness prevails, that the right thing will happen, it sets the tone for how you interact in the world, how you see the world. And as you probably know, and I didn't really talk about this, our bodies have a certain amount of energy that they give off. And I'm sure you've had experiences where there are people who you are around and they emanate goodness, love, etc. And in fact, you look at people like the Dalai Lama or maybe Amma, the hugging saint, or some of these people. And that's the great thing about being in their presence for me, is because I get to feed off all of this wonderful energy. So I'm a very selfish person. And it's not that I seek them out, but I have these relationships and it's joyful for me. But being able to be like that and walk the world, and you do give off energy. This energy is measurable. In fact, if you look at the energy that comes from your heart, actually, you can measure it 5 or 6 feet away. And this is why there are people who walk in a room and the energy completely changes, and people feel love, they feel positivity, they want to connect, they feel happy. And then there are other people who have a sourness about them and who are takers, and we call them energy vampires sometimes. Everything about them separates you from them. And it's sadly unfortunate because on some level, many of those people are suffering, but that's truth. And of course, if at all possible, I think all of us would like to be the former rather than the latter. And that choice is one that we can make for ourselves. And it's the path that I try to follow, although, as I said, I'm a failing, fragile human being who's trying to do the best they can, which I think most of us want to be. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of wabi-sabi, which is this Japanese Buddhist narrative of the reality of our imperfection, our impermanence, and our incompleteness. And if you understand that, you are much more calmer in terms of how you interact in this world and more accepting. The other aspect of this, which is connected, of course, is the concept of kintsugi. And this is the repairing of broken pottery with glue that has been embedded with gold. Now, the metaphor for that is, of course, and this began, I think, in the 16th century, is that many of us hide the fact that we have been broken or damaged or hurt. And we try to hide that from people because, again, of our anxiety and our fear of being judged. Yet, it is this brokenness that we have survived. And that is the glue, the gold that defines our humanity, our survival, how we see the world, how we connect with the world. And there's nothing to be ashamed of about that. You should be honored for being yourself and surviving. And the gold that glues us all together after we've been broken is something that we should share with others, be proud of, and use that to help other people.
Thank you, James. Is anyone else there? I know there was another question from
I have a question.
E. Thompson.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, Lee. How can I be of service to you?
Oh, you're always a service, my friend. First of all, thank you for today. What a treat. Second of all, I wonder if you would share with us this is all interesting information, data, you know, experience, science, you know, all of that sort of stuff. But unless we use it in the world to bring more compassion into the world, it's all a waste of time. So you've done some amazing things, which I am the beneficiary of, having taken your year-long applied compassion training program. I wonder if you'd share with our listeners the programs that you offer to people to enable them to be their most natural genetic selves.
Sure. So fundamentally, my goal is to promote compassion through whatever mechanism that is, but at the center at Stanford, we have a variety of programs, one of which Lee has taken, which is 11 months long. And we go in depth into the nature of compassion. It's primarily an online program. But the wonderful thing about it is that we mentor the students in developing a capstone project, which then they take back to their home organization and implement. And typically, these are people from the corporate healthcare or the mind-body well-being space. And we have people from over 60 countries. It's impacted well over 1 million people. And it's a very, very powerful program. And again, it gets back to the narrative that when you are of service to others, it is a multiplying effect. When people see you being compassionate, when they see you being kind, when they experience it, then they act in that way. And in fact, this is the wonderful thing about compassion, although conversely, negative aspects can also be used in the same way, sadly. But if you promote the right negative and narrative and people see you caring and loving and kind and thoughtful and compassionate, that motivates them to be the same way. And so that's one of the programs. We have another program, which is an 8-week-long program that potentially is for everybody, although many of them are specifically designed for different populations. One is for physicians or healthcare people. The other is for first responders. And we also have some for students. And then we have corporate programs. The interesting thing is what has repeatedly been demonstrated is that when you authentically integrate kindness and compassion into the workplace, in regard to the recognition that the employees deserve dignity and respect, and they're not just widgets, and also integrate them actually into some level of decision making, or at least listening to what they have to say, what happens? Their productivity goes up, their creativity goes up, the healthcare costs diminish, because unfortunately, so many health problems are related to your mental attitude and state and are either caused by or aggravated by a negative mental state. And human resources costs go dramatically down, because if you're unhappy at work or disengaged, you're not going to take a promotion. You're constantly looking for another job, and you continue to be disengaged, which leads to decreased productivity. And so this keeps the human resources department constantly rehiring people because people are unhappy. And so there's huge advantage if in every sector of society, and if you look at the problems in the school system, by teaching children a mindfulness program or emotion regulation, it's very, very powerful. Now, I would caution using that statement, not only for children, but for everyone, because it's not a Band-Aid. The goal of these things is not to give a temporary Band-Aid and continue an unjust system. It's to give them something to support them and hopefully change the system if necessary. As an example, we're talking about ruthless capitalism. Well, the goal of ruthless capitalism is to take care of to destroy the social safety net, which the stupidity of that is, though, that what happens is then if there's no, let's say, post-delivery leave, if there's no unemployment, if you don't pay teachers enough, if there's no mental health support, if the criminal justice system continues to be one of not rehabilitation, but promoting recidivism by not being nice, you create a system that undermines every aspect of our humanity, which makes everyone unhappy for the benefit of a very small percentage of people. So as an example, you can teach these programs to children at school, but if they have an unstable home life with mental illness or drug or alcohol abuse, or they're hungry, they're not going to perform well in school, and they're not going to learn these different practices. So it has to be a holistic understanding of it's not just one problem. All of these problems, though, arise because of a lack of compassion in our world. And looking through the lens of compassion and saying, what can I do to improve the lives of others, is an extraordinarily cost-effective way to do things. And it's not short-sighted. It is one that actually has a multitude of rewards in the long term. But we have to change how we look at the world.
Thank you, Dr. Doty. You're a beacon of light in a world that needs it.
Well, that's sweet of you. It's funny. My wife has said at times in her angry mode, they call you Mr. Compassion. Well, I think you're an asshole. So there you have it sometimes.
Oh, you're keeping it real, James. Great. Would
What
anyone
can I tell you?
like to
Yeah.
ask a question? Would anyone else like to take this? Li Ching, please.
Hi, Dr. Doty. Well, my question is actually, you talk about compassion. Well, I try to be, well, I have some memory problem and I'm epileptic. And so more and more so, my friends and my relatives, they drop me off because of, they know that if they're with me and they have to be responsible, or actually I have some memory problems, so when I say something, I may not be saying what actually happened. So the interaction is very, very strange. But what my question is, from my point of view, though, I try to extend myself and trying to really be compassionate. But it seems like there's a lot of walls out there in terms of people receiving what I would like to exchange.
Well, that's truth. And if you look at the work of Paul Gilbert, who developed something called compassion-focused therapy, fear of compassion is real. And yeah, and you have to understand why they are fearful of compassion, right? But it's not hopeless, but you also have to be patient. And, somebody said, what's the difference? It's, I can't remember what I'm trying to remember, but basically you have to look through the lens of other people to try to understand the drivers and the motivators, why they are fearful of compassion. I talked earlier about the baggage we all carry. If people haven't addressed that, then that can affect how they interact with other people, or they feel that if somebody's compassionate to them, that it's going to require them to put forth effort. And it can be very fearful for a number of people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, if you can say anything more about that can help me in terms of well, mentally, like you said, I try to look at it from the other people's point of view, and just knowing from the little things I've told you so far, let me take the opportunity to ask you any advice you would give me.
Well, I think the best advice is to be patient, and all we can do is the best we can do with whatever we have as a human being and whatever those limitations are. Again, if you've done everything you can, there's nothing more you can do. And there's no reason to in any way think that because that hasn't occurred, it's not necessarily your fault. Now, that's not to say that we can all learn from others and perhaps learn different techniques. But if you're doing the best you can, nobody can ask any more of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask before our time runs out?
Any questions in the room?
I have a quick question about your new book.
Ron?
Yeah, I have a quick question about your new book, the Mind Magic book. I know that you're not coming from this place. I mean, I intuit that you're not, but when you hear the word manifestation, it immediately conjures up New Age ideas like The Secret, and even going farther back to like the 19th century with mind cure movement or prosperity gospel, or even like Norman Vincent Peale's book, Think and Grow Rich, which is a book.
Napoleon Hill.
Yeah, Napoleon Hill. Well, Donald Trump, I think, is a fan of the Think and Grow Rich book. But how is your book different? And
He's also a fan of Mein Kampf too. But that's actually, I'm glad you asked that. This book actually is the antithesis of The Secret completely. And in fact, the first sentence of the book actually is, the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. And because the power is within yourself. And I talked about some of these topics. So the narrative that the law of attraction and The Secret have is that you want something, you send out a message of positivity to the universe, and the universe answers you back, and suddenly your life is complete and all is good. Part of the problem with that is, of course, if it fails, then there's also the narrative that it's your fault it failed and you didn't do enough. So that is fundamentally all incorrect. If you look at the science, and I mentioned some of these brain networks, the way in which your brain networks function the best is when you are in the parasympathetic mode. And what happens then is that the way you get there, of course, is you have to look through the lens of compassion and caring for others. And this is why I also said earlier that when you look through that lens, you change a bit from what you think you want to what you need. And this gets back as an example. If you look at, unfortunately, high school students today, what do they tell you? They tell you they want to be rich. They tell you they want to be an influencer. They tell you they want to be a celebrity, or they tell you they want to be a professional athlete. And the problem is, this is what our capitalist society has brainwashed people to believe is important. And nothing could be further from the truth. And fundamentally, this ascribes or subscribes to the secret narrative. I want, I deserve, I have, if I get this, people will think I'm important, I will feel important. And again, that's a falsity, which we've already talked about. So the narrative of this book is, one, the difference between what you think you want and what you actually need. As I said, many people want things because they're been brainwashed into believe the hedonic narrative of happiness. This book is about understanding that if you engage the parasympathetic nervous system, if you look through the lens of compassion and caring for others, what you really need is what you get from being kind and compassionate, which is your physiology working at its best, your brain cognitive networks working at their best, your physiology working at its best, and you living longer. And so if you look at how the brain networks function, first of all, you start with the default mode network. And this is this network in our brain that is self-referential. It is associated with daydreaming and mind wandering. but it's also where you create narratives about yourself or narratives about things you want. And what happens is then that information gets transferred to what we call your salience network. How do you make something salient? And once you embed your intention into your subconscious, and actually the book talks about this, so you have to buy the book, as well as my other book. Once you embed your intention, this activates the salience network. So it's like a bloodhound in the sense you've given it a narrative that it has to fulfill. So what it does is it starts looking around in the world to how do I fulfill this intention? And this also then engages your attention network to focus your attention. And as an example to you, once you're able to do that, and there's a possibility, or you've created an environment where things can happen, then it gets handed off to your executive control network, or you could call the CEO of this, where it actually makes it happen. As an example, about attention and how things get embedded. If you're at a party somewhere and it's very noisy, if you hear your name, you immediately turn to it, even above all the noise, because who you are is deeply embedded with you and you turn to that. I'll give you another example. In my own practice as a neurosurgeon, I may tell somebody, geez, you have hydrocephalus as an example. And they'll sit there and they'll say, I have never heard of that. Really? Is this common? Yet 6 weeks or 2 months later, if they see me again, they'll go, you know, the most amazing thing happened. I've run into 5 people who have the exact same thing. It's like saying, you know, I've been thinking of getting a red Porsche, and suddenly there are hundreds of red Porsches everywhere. And the reason is you have embedded this in your intention into your subconscious, and you're always looking out for it. And it's no longer, it's subconscious, you don't realize it. And this is the nature of synchronicity and coincidence. I was actually at a coffee shop recently, and I've been working on a project, very noisy, completely crowded, yet above all the din, I heard words associated with the project I'm working on, which led me to get up, introduce myself, and now those individuals are working with me on this project. This is how embedding your intention the right way attunes your subconscious to be constantly on the lookout for these things or opportunities to manifest. And so I want you to also understand, though, this is not a perfect system. It's not like 100%. And some people get confused. Well, you know, I wish for this to happen. Well, as an example, I've been thinking of doing a World Compassion Festival for 15 years, and it hasn't happened yet. But I have this internal sense of an optimistic disposition, and I truly believe it will happen. I'm not tied to the outcome, and this is one of the aspects too. You have to not be attached to outcome. That creates misery. You have to accept that things will work in their own time frame. They may not work perfect, and in fact, they may not work at all. And the reason they may not work at all is it's not your fault. It's sometimes there are competing circumstances, there are other needs, or what you have wished for or desired actually is not good for you. And so what the goal of this book is to create the optimal environment which allows you to manifest. Understanding, though, there are no guarantees about any of this. It's like saying, what do I have to do to run a marathon, right? There are certain ways you train, and there are certain things you shouldn't do. And this gives you, and in fact, in this book is a 6-week program that outlines a way in which you can train your brain. And we know, based on neuroplasticity and all sorts of other stuff, that you can train your brain and you can maximize your ability to manifest. But it's not, it requires work. You have to show up. You have to do all the stuff that's necessary. And then you create the environment for that to occur. But as I said, this is the complete antithesis of everything The Secret has said. Now,
That's great.
Yeah, I would suggest though, do you know how many books The Secret sold?
A lot. Yeah,
37 million.
I know.
And the sad thing is, it's because of this false narrative that has been corrupted our society about this success equaling things, power, position, money, versus looking through the lens of compassion and being of service to the world. So the whole purpose of this book is to change that narrative and make people understand through science what the power of compassion can do, has the ability to do to change your brain. I see your son back there dancing. He's a very handsome young man. I don't know what he's dancing for, but it's not quite as good as watching golf there earlier, but it's competing closely with it.
Thank you, James. That was great. And I really appreciate how you've articulated your view and your approach. And it seems like that we're always manifesting. And it sounds like what you're saying is almost like you said, with a ultra marathon runner, we're trying to optimize, integrate our systems so that we can manifest not just for ourselves, right?
Exactly. And you're absolutely correct. We are always manifesting. And the problem is most of us do it very inefficiently. I mean, we may sit there and go, I'd really like this to happen, and that's done. Versus there are very specific techniques, just as there are for training mindfulness, to maximize your ability. And hopefully that's what I lay out in this book. The other aspect is we talk about marathon running. You don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to run a marathon. It's a process, and it's a process of habit. So this also talks about baby steps and doing small habits, and then getting used to having success with those. As an example, I wake up in the morning and I'm going to walk to the corner. That's the start. And once you get used to that and realize you can do it, then you extend it. And the same is true here. You don't start by trying to run the marathon the very first day. And, this is a problem I've had and a lot of people had. That's why New Year's resolutions never work, right? Like, I'm going to lose this amount of weight by the end of January. And then you're 10 pounds heavier, right? Versus saying, today I'm going to cut out having that chocolate bar at noontime and do that, and then slowly build up to doing other things. So I think that's also an important aspect of this.
There's a question in the room. Can I just have, maybe make this the last one? Can you speak? Lady in the room, lady in blue?
Yes, I'm trying to read it.
What?
Yeah.
Here I am.
Let's see, I just finished research showing the fear of compassion is higher in people in higher.
No.
That's not.
Yeah, you can speak into the microphone.
There's someone in,
Yes, okay, I'm Liz. And I wanted to say something that
You speak into the microphone.
I wanted to say something because it's what I noticed recently is that, let's say I have an intention and I'm doing something and the thing blasts, it doesn't work. If I just stay calm, something else occurs. It's actually better. I'm finding that happening all the time.
Well, actually, oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Even coming here, I came Thursday and I walked around here, the place was all locked up. I thought, that's strange. And then where are the labels that are saying, inviting the public? I didn't see anything. So today I thought, well, I looked back in here and it's Friday, right? Well, by the way, this is a magazine I got at the Senior Center. So I came today and I was in a bad mood because I lost my credit card, So, but I thought, well, no, I want to hear this. So I got here and it was just I parked across the street, because yesterday I worked out all of that and I found out where to go. And I still walked around the same place, everything was closed, and I knocked on the door and talked to it, but it didn't happen. So I came back and I said, oh, doorbell. The next thing just presents itself, and then this lovely man comes in, lets me in. And what do I have here? I mean, it's phenomenal. So that's kind of what's happening with me a lot. So if I just release and say, okay, what's next? Then surprises come. And it's because I learned something. So that's what's happening in my life.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful insight. And one of the things you said, I think is very important, is on some level, it's emotion regulation, because as soon as you shift over to engagement of your sympathetic nervous system and become anxious, that limits your possibilities, because you shut down your executive control function, where if you're calm and open and you've engaged your parasympathetic nervous system, you become or choices, many more choices become available to you, and you're much more discerning. So that's a wonderful insight, and it further substantiates, I think, what we've been talking about. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, James, it's I think maybe close to the time. We have 6 more minutes left, but tonight's been just a real so many stories of true stories of compassion, and just being able to dive in with your life and your experiences gives us an opportunity to look into our own lives and see how compassion can play a role. And so we're very blessed to have you with us, and we hope we can have you again at Dharma College in person. And we hope that all of those people who had to sign off and sign in, I'm so sorry about that. We'll try to remedy that for our next talk. And Ron, thank you for arranging our great speaker tonight. And Ron, do you want to say something more about what's going to happen what's not going to happen over the summer, and when?
Taking a break in the summer, but I want to just say to James, Wang Mo and Richard's son is a freshman at Tulane. Just started at Tulane, your alma mater. Is that correct?
Yes, and I've talked to you about Tulane.
I'm happy to talk about that. You know, it's interesting, and just to throw another story out very quickly, if I may.
Sure.
You talk about manifestation. So I had obviously a very challenging childhood. It was a miracle I got into college, but I had a lot of challenges in college. And in fact, when I applied to medical school, my grade point average was 2.53, with the average grade point average of acceptance to medical school being 3.76. And in fact, I went to the pre-med committee because we had to get a letter from them. And the secretary said to me, I'm not giving you an appointment because it's a waste of everybody's time. Now, can you imagine somebody telling you something like that? And so then I said, I'm not leaving here until you give me an appointment. And she did. And I go into this room where there are 3 professors, and I'm sure you've seen the photographs of Putin seen at the end of one table and then the other people at the other end. This is exactly what it was like. And the guy in charge, he takes my file and he throws it down on the table and he says, say what you have to say so we can get this over with. Which again is a horrible thing for a young person to have to face a jerk like that. Now, fortunately, I had the wherewithal and belief in myself where I looked at this fellow and I said, I refuse to let you objectify me into a number. You know nothing about me. And then I proceeded to lecture them for about 20 minutes. And the problem is that once you force somebody to look at you as a human being, they cannot turn away from you. So at the end of it, they were actually all crying. Okay. and I ended up getting the highest letter of recommendation. And the secretary who refused to give me that appointment, she was there the whole time. She came up to me and she said, listen, I want to give you this. And actually, it was for a summer enrichment program at Tulane for minority students and socioeconomically disadvantaged students. She said to me, I want you to know, though, that the deadline has passed, but I don't think that will have any impact on you. So I ended up calling the lady who ran the program. She let me into the program. I was accepted to medical school with that 2.53, and I did not get my degree from Irvine.
Wow.
And I seemingly did okay.
I think so. Yeah.
But
Amazing.
but the rest of the story is as follows. After Hurricane Katrina, the medical school was flooded. The library was severely damaged. The dean, and they moved the medical school to Baylor for 2 years. The dean resigned because he went into a depression. So when they were looking for a new dean, there was a fellow from Harvard, and he would come, but only if he got an endowed chair, which academics here, of course, know what that is, and that's where a private donator, a private philanthropist makes a donation in their name. The chair is named after them, and then those funds from that come from an endowment help support the person's research or whatever. And it's considered one of the highest academic honors. Anyway, so I ended up repairing the library, funding the dean's chair, and I'm on the board of governors. So the dean to this day and will remain the Doty professor. I rebuilt the library. Wow. And so the person who oftentimes you may not believe has the ability actually makes us appreciate that no one can judge what someone else is capable of. You can only choose what you're capable of, and that is also a choice. But you can never judge the ability of another person to do something extraordinary. And again, I have very close and great affection to Tulane for obvious reasons, and am still very much involved in them. And just as I am at Stanford, which has also been a blessing to me. And in fact, I endowed a chair at Stanford as well. So the person who was probably, by some people's interpretation, the least likely to succeed